time this morning on the 10th of October 2021 to our Caron YouTube audience, to our President Assembly in the auditorium here, and to those of you around the campus who are watching on live stream. My name is Reverend Jack, and I'm an addict. Thank you. Repeating our preliminaries just for the YouTube community, but I don't know why I felt like it would be helpful for me to center myself before I launch into what we have to talk about and think about today. I am grateful for a chance to reflect on a theme which comes up for me in rotation every 18 weeks, I think is my cycle. And I try to bring a fresh perspective, and I got a whole new take on the theme of hope today. What I would like to begin with is sort of positioning hope as a endpoint of a spectrum on which the opposite endpoint is meaninglessness. And so I'm not sure, more so than thinking about either hope or meaninglessness as concrete states in a on-off way, like I'm either in hope or not in hope, or I'm either in meaningless or not in meaninglessness. I really think that we as human beings in the human imagination and experience can drift towards hope or away from hope, and as we drift away from hope, we drift towards meaninglessness, and then as we get more into meaninglessness, we can come back towards hope. This is the kind of thought that I have, is that what I'm talking about is a continuum of movement that we have, and that these two poles, hope and chaos, are like horizon points, or for the mathematicians, asymptotic limits. And like Zeno's paradox, we can get halfway to the distance and then halfway to the distance, but we may never actually be fully and perfectly in hope. And I pray we never are fully and perfectly in meaninglessness. That also makes me want to stop for a second and recall a fellow who was here many years ago. And I don't know if he is still alive or not. For a while I stayed connected with him after his departure from here. His first name was Sam. And Sam had a profound effect on me. It's interesting to tell you as I started to talk about him. I can remember him just as if it was much more recently that he was here. Oh, I was going to do this with you, so I'm getting a lot of breathing. Hang on a second. So, if that'll sit still. My apologies for the tech antics. Oh, I like that better myself. So, Sam. Sam came to Caron as a teen patient who had already had significant mental health treatment, primarily for depression and suicidality. He had multiple attempts at taking his own life. And as you might understand, his family were terrified that he was going to complete the suicide attempt and they would lose their son. And one of the features of the way he struggled to survive was cannabis. And so he ended up being referred to us and diagnosed with a cannabis use disorder way back when we would have used other language for that diagnosis, but that's what we would say today. And of course, people really, a lot of people still wonder if weed is addictive or not. But I have to tell you, Sam is one of those people who made me really believe in the marijuana addiction thing, and I totally subscribe to it as a piece of the whole puzzle. So anyway, to get back to Sam's story, Sam was a concern for the entire clinical team, because when we have patients who are here who are have recent history of active suicide attempts, of course we have to be much more careful. And I was asked at that time, I don't do a lot of one-on-one consults with our young male population today, but at that time I was a generalist around the campus, and I would see patients from every one of our continuums because we had a much smaller spiritual care footprint. And I ended up having some time one-to-one with Sam, actually a couple of sessions. And I was struck by how deep and really brilliant he was. And I don't think that's peculiar in one sense, because I think that sometimes great intellect and great mental suffering can go together. But he really, really was a smart young fellow. And we connected on tragedy, and which is a thing I really love. I don't like horror movies, but apparently I do, because I like Shakespeare. And So we were talking about Shakespearean tragedies, and he knew some of the Shakespearean literature. And one of the things that we focused on was a soliloquy, very famous. Most of you know a line from it, even if you don't know the play Hamlet, in which the opening line is to be or not to be. That is the question. My guess is some of you have heard that quotation. And that's the beginning of a soliloquy about existence. And the way Sam and I talked about that was, I was trying to position him on this spectrum between hope and despair. And the day that Sam and I talked about the Macbeth soliloquy, that following Sunday in chapel, he was sitting over there, and he came to the microphone, and he had written a rewrite of the soliloquy. And he said, I'm Sam, I'm an alcoholic, or whatever it was he said, and I was talking to Reverend Jack about my struggles with mental health. We were talking about a famous passage, and it occurred to me that Shakespeare doesn't capture where I am with this. And so he'd rewritten in pentameter this poem, and it started out this way. He said, to be or not to be, there is no question. And he went on to try and say that, like, I'm a person, when I usually do this topic, and I was telling myself I might not, but I usually quote an Emily Dickinson poem, which I love, about hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings a tune without words and never stops at all. So this idea that hope, and Emily Dickinson struggled with mental health and depression, but interestingly, her poem speaks about this thing which there's an aphorism that says hope springs eternal in the human heart. And Emily Dickinson occupies that pole, that there's always a candle of hope alive, or there's always that little tweeting bird in the soul. But Sam said, no, not necessarily for me. Sam said, I get to the place where I'm close enough to the entirety of meaninglessness that, like a black hole, its gravitational pull holds me, and I can't come out. I can't get to the light. And it was helpful for me because I've always had trouble understanding, because I've never been that despairing. I've certainly struggled. I've certainly been in one after another pickle, or one after another circumstance where hope seems further away. But I don't think I've ever known where he was trying to tell me where he goes. So if hope and meaninglessness are these things, and that we can even get to this point where meaninglessness, chaos, and nihilism are all that we see and know, what is it that there is more to say about that in terms of you and you and the audience here, or me? So, memory is tremendously important in this, because when we remember difficult events and victories, those to me are drivers of our movement on the spectrum. So if you're at a certain place in the continuum of hope and you start reenacting disaster narratives in your head, where's it going to take you? It's going to take you down, right? But if you are at a certain place in the continuum between hope and despair, and you are called to remember victories and times that turned out to be not as dark as they have seemed in the moment, then that can pull you towards hope. So the power of memory is tremendously important in this. And secondly, this is another thing that makes this topic really tough, is that anthropologists and neuroscientists tell us that human beings are evolved and the brain is constructed in such a way that it remembers the negative experience way more than it remembers the positive experience. So we're sort of set up to go towards Eeyore instead of, towards the, Glinda the Good Witch. Like pick your, emblem of hope in literature. I don't know who that would be. But so this is not an easy thing. And of course, one of the reasons it has relevance is because of whatever crisis brings view to my attention. And I'll get there in a second. But the other thing I wanted to say was that if this is driven in part by the memories that we recall, the stories of the past, the other way of like really making this metaphor rich is to think of our current circumstances as the landscape, the terrain in which we have this horizon over here and this horizon over there, and we have memory as sort of fuel for the car. And each person's horizon, I mean each person's landscape location, where a GPS of hope would locate you, is unique to you. But some of us have common themes about the terrain in which we are finding ourselves. So, first of all, I'm here at Caron, and this is Magic Mountain. And so this is a place where people come because use disorders are ruling lives and ruining family cohesion. So that's one of the things we know. And we know it's not just alcohol, which is where it started in the recovery movement in 1935 with alcohol. We know it's not just alcohol and drugs. We know it's also behaviors and relationships. So gambling, shopping, sex, and pornography, these are all pieces of the whole continuum of disordered behaviors that come together to be part of our shared struggle. And then there are other things that are happening in the climate around us, and I say that because climate, first of all, like climate change, I just heard some amazing statistics that were really depressing about how many billion-dollar weather events happen in average in a year in the current time versus how many happened, say, 20 or 50 years ago. And the number of billion-dollar cataclysmic weather events has dramatically increased. And so while people have struggled with climate change and what to assert or not assert about it, but that's data. So we have data that shows that climate seems to be changing, and that there are many more cataclysmic events than used to be. I remember, I'm old enough to remember when these hurricanes, disasters, and fires and those sorts of things were much less frequent. I feel like every time I turn on the news, I'm hearing about some other just really grim statistics. So that's part of what's the climate right now. Then there's a social climate. And in the social climate, the thing that I guess we're all, hopefully, I keep noticing when I'm watching television is the woke-unwoke dynamic is a thing in our social climate. And again, I'm not trying to pick a fight or bring anything specifically around either climate change politics or social diversity, equity, and inclusion politics, but it is a thing that is called to our attention in our world at the moment. And I personally, of course, think for good. I think it comes across, obviously, because many of you get to know who I am. But again, I'm not trying to go down. I'm just trying to understand where are we as we think about hope. And then the other thing is, in addition to that, the political climate, which is, stalemate and bizarre and contentious. And, I was talking with my wife. I talk about her all the time. And you may be a fan of one or the other of the polarities on the political spectrum, but my wife and I were just sitting there going, I don't know if I like anybody on either side. They're all subject to criticism, is my point. And I usually pray on Sundays that our institutions would be restored to the remembrance of their founding noble purposes, because I feel like that's what has gotten us far awry, is that institutions now serve themselves in their own interests instead of serving the interests for which they were founded. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff, climate negative, to be worried about. And then there is your individual narrative, which, as I pointed to at the beginning of the message, because you're sitting here, probably also isn't great. I'm guessing that being in Orangeville, Pennsylvania wasn't on your 2021 plan. It wasn't, you haven't been really looking forward to this, and it's a tell to those of us who get a chance to meet you, like our drummer who just showed up on Wednesday. I'm like, what? The first time a person walks in, we all know that. When you welcome a new patient, there's got to be a rough, bumpy ride right before getting here. It's just how it is. And it could be for one person that it involves an arrest and the law. It could be for another person that the family's dissolving, or divorce papers, or an alienated child, or a child alienated from a parent. Like whatever the I'm trying to not cuss here, but whatever the manure is that is in the context around you, it's there. So as we try to figure out what we think about ourselves and this dual dynamic that we have the capacity to use something which is, I'm going to use the word wisdom. So it's a word I use almost every week, and it's one of my favorite things, and it's a word I had a teacher who helped me sort of understand that that's a very helpful organizing word for the families of the world's religious traditions. So I learned in Hebrew studies in my New Testament, in my Christian theological formation, that there were wisdom writings in the Scripture. But I mean this in a much more global sense, not just the Proverbs within the writings that people in the Christian community call the Bible. But I mean the whole Bible is essentially a wisdom teaching in that sense. And I would say that the Caron and the Gita and the Vedas and the different texts that are used in different wisdom traditions are wisdom writings in a larger sense. They're encapsulated narratives and types of literature that encode information from the past to guide us. And one of the things I just started saying recently, but I think is really cool and interesting to think about, like you can think about 12-step recovery as a wisdom tradition, and I think it is. I think it merits that classification. And the function, not the function, a function of wisdom traditions in human history is to recall survival from bad experience. So one of the reasons why those wisdom traditions serve us is to help us in the problem that our own individual lives, where brains are wired to go Eeyore, but the wisdom tradition is going to point us towards Linda the Good Witch, right? So and quick examples of how that's certainly true. The Jesus narrative is a story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And I was taught by one of the most profound theological influences in my life, Doug Meeks, that this signaled God's victory over sin, sickness, evil, and even death. So that story is a story of the divine triumph in ultimacy. That no matter how grim the story is in any day-to-day moment, this singular event in history is a preview of God's ultimate victory. That was what I was taught, was a way of understanding Christian theology. Many of my Jewish friends have taught me so much, and Passover and Yom Kippur are centerpieces of Jewish life. And the two of them are cyclical. Yom Kippur each new year. What we rehearse at Passover is the victory of coming out of slavery and captivity and deliverance from exile. So this is Judaism, remembering the faithfulness of God and the ability of the community to survive even the most horrid circumstances. And I think we could go on. I think we could go on to Buddhism and its notion of the progress of the person and individuals and communities towards enlightenment as a narrative of hope in the face of suffering. And I think we have a patient here who probably could do a much better job than I could speaking about Hinduism, but I think in Hinduism too you have these remembered narratives of triumph and of the presence of the divine. And one of the Hindu emphases is also practice, that lived wisdom works to get us through and towards a better place. So we are here at Caron in the chapel service that was instituted by an incredibly interesting fellow, Father Bill Holtberg, and this Sunday moment every week stands as a wisdom marker for every patient who comes to this place, whether they attend chapel or not. This is still the place where the song of hope is sung. This is where the light of hope is lit. This is where the threat of nihilism and meaninglessness and chaos and death and disaster is called out for what it is. It does not rule, it does not win in every person, in every day, in every end. We proclaim hope here as the chapel service is. It's one of the really powerful ways I think of thinking about why this thing has had such incredible magnetism and staying power in this institution. Much more so than either Bill or myself. It's the message that you, as patients, bring to the table here, which is, I will survive, and we will survive. Our families can come back together. We can form community. We can live another day. We can not let the past and its grimness define us, but instead we can let it teach us to make positive movement. And we can remember, what we remember is that people do recover. That's one of the reasons why I can't wait to get alumni coins celebrations back here, because that used to be one of the really great drivers of the Caron Chapel services. You'd be sitting here and you'd go, oh, I have like a meeting next week about sober living, and I don't want to do it. Or, whatever is the, demands that are being imposed upon you by a treatment team that you think of as adversarial. When it's really, what we do when we come here as staff is we try every day to try and figure out how to help you save your life. So, I don't know if it's occurred to you that we really do come with really good intentions, and we understand why it sometimes seems like we're pushing stuff you don't want to hear. But it's driven by our experience that recovery does happen, and it really does work. And a couple last things I want to say before I shut up. So, one of the things that also I think is hopeful for me is the growth in my own discipline in addiction care. So I'm an addiction clinician and a chaplain, and I think chaplains are getting better at being chaplains today, and I think addiction professionals are getting better at being addiction professionals today. And one of the reasons why is that I think we have figured out to move the mark for what we're hoping for. Because I think that AA, in all its beauty, I'm an AA dude, I love AA, I have a sponsor, I have a home group, I participate, I sponsor people, it's the engine of my recovery. And yet, in 1939, as AA develops, it falls lure and prey to this kind of binary thinking, where what it does is it names success as pure, total, and perfect abstinence. And it calls anything less than that failure, in a sense. When we develop this language of relapse, which I think is tremendously unhelpful, and I think that addiction treatment is seeking to find new language to talk about refractory illness and recurrence, and here's the contrary example, which is worth thinking about. If we are treating, as medical professionals, things like diabetes or heart disease, and our patients come in and they are not terribly, they're not eating well, they're not exercising, they're not exhibiting wellness practices, right? And I'm a doc, and I'm like, Frank or Judy or whatever it is your name, here's what our labs tell you, here's what we see, you had this critical event, you had a heart event, or you had a diabetic moment, or you had whatever, and we want you to understand that if you inhabit a set of wellness practices, you're going to improve your outcomes. And what we're going to do is we're going to start tracking you. So let's estimate in the last 365 days, how many days your wellness practice was subpar. Well, most people finding out that they have a crisis issue have not for the last, let's say 300 of the last 365 days. I probably wasn't eating well, I wasn't exercising, I wasn't doing all those things. It was very normal, right? And then the doc makes a note, and a year later in a follow-up appointment says, well, this is 12 months since we've been trying to address your chronic illness. How did you do in the last 365 days? And the patient is able to say, well, actually, I probably only had 65 days where I was not eating well, or I was not exercising. But I had 300 days, so I flipped the ratio, right? 1/6 of the year, I was not contributing to my wellness, and 5/6 of the year, I was contributing to my wellness instead of the opposite. Right? 5/6, I'm pulling the train this way, and 1/6, I could argue, were at least nominal or at least improving it. Well, any doctor is going to be like, yay, that's awesome. That's a thing that I think that addiction care providers are beginning to remember. That this is what we do, and I'm sort of an example on both sides. Like, I am a person who was able to stop drinking and had stay stopped, which is awesome. So that's important to realize, is that it is possible to achieve and sustain particular forms of abstinence over extremely long periods of time. So, and that's a word of hope. It's not a word of anything. It doesn't mean that you have to meet that, but it's to tell you that it's absolutely possible for people to not drink, who drink every day. I'm one of them, and there are millions of me. So it is absolutely possible. However, I also have to tell you that in my 32 plus years of not drinking, I have battled Cheetos and other much less innocuous things. I've seen addiction rear its head in my life and my behavior. And workaholism and exercise and some of the other things that I will keep to myself, but I still carry a coin in my wallet that celebrates my 32 years of chemical sobriety. But I also have come to realize that I need to be careful to brag about how incredibly, because I'm not perfect. And this is where somehow I think Bill Wilson was given a right thought, where in the literature it says we claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. And so the hope that I extend to you, wherever you are, if this is your first time in treatment, I hope you have what happened to me, which is that you can start being stopped and stay stopped. It's the best, easiest, most wonderful way. Annoyingly, there are people who don't even come here who stop and stay stopped. It's the untold story of addiction, is that a lot of people do successfully stop, which is awesome for them, even though they annoy me. Because I need a lot of help to stay stopped. And that doesn't mean I'm defective. It just is part of who I am. It's as if I were to have like dyslexia or something like that, and I need certain supports in my reading. I need certain kinds of supports for me to navigate life successfully. And I am so excited to tell you that those helps are there for me, and they're there for you. So do not let the black hole of despair suck you in like my former patient Sam, who I pray, and God knows, hear this message and contact me and say, dude, I'm still alive, which would be awesome. Let us proclaim hope for one another and share it with the world. Thanks.